No furnace, no electricity, no insulation from the hardware store, just a frozen cabin, a howling wind, and a winter night so cold your breath would turn to ice before you could finish a prayer. Out there in the American wilderness, the temperature could drop to minus 30 degrees F in hours, and in the deadliest winters, minus 50 degrees F for weeks at a time. There was no cozy fireplace scene here. There was a choice to stay warm or die before dawn. One misjudged fire, one night without preparation, and entire families were found in the morning, frozen still in their beds. And yet, some survived. Not by luck, not by chance, but by using heat sources that burned all night without dying, insulation that trapped warmth without a single inch of modern material, and life-saving protocols that kicked in when everything else failed. These were not just survival tricks. They were systems, engineered from wood, stone, fir, and human grit that turned a freezing cabin into a fortress against the cold. And today, I'm going to take you inside the exact strategies that frontier families used to keep their children alive in the worst winters in American history. On the American frontier, the fireplace was not just a source of heat, it was the beating heart of survival. When the wind screamed against the walls and the temperature outside fell so low that even the trees seemed to crack in the cold, that fireplace was all that stood between a family and the creeping silence of death. It was not enough to simply build a place for flames to dance. The design had to be deliberate, the execution precise, because in the wilderness heat was not a luxury, it was life itself. The difference between a poorly built fireplace and a masterfully engineered one could mean the difference between waking to the sound of a crackling fire or never waking at all. A truly efficient fireplace began with its sheer size and depth. Frontier families often constructed them large enough to hold logs 4 feet in length, not because they wanted to impress visitors, but because longer logs burned slower and produced heat for much longer stretches of time. In the still darkness of a winter night, that meant hours of warmth without having to rise from bed to tend the flames. The firebox itself, that recessed chamber where the wood burned, was shaped with purpose. Its sides were angled, not straight, reflecting precious heat out into the living space instead of letting it vanish uselessly up the chimney. This design acted like a giant reflector, bouncing warmth back into the room where every degree mattered. The back wall of the firebox often slanted slightly forward, a small but critical detail that pushed even more heat toward the center of the cabin. Above it, the chimney was carefully crafted with a damper system that allowed the family to control airflow with surprising precision. A wide, open damper might roar with heat at first but waste fuel by letting warmth escape. A damper closed too tightly could choke the fire and cause smoke to roll into the room. The sweet spot, the setting that produced a steady, hot burn without wasting energy, was learned through long winters of observation, trial, and error. Beyond structure, the real magic of an efficient fireplace was in its relationship with thermal mass. This was the principle that heat could be stored in heavy materials and released slowly over time. Even after the flames died down, frontier families lined the base and sides of their fireplaces with large stones or thick bricks. These absorbed the heat of the fire while it burned and then, in the early hours of morning, continued to radiate warmth into the cabin. Some homes went even further, extending stone wings or heat sinks outward into the living area. These functioned like giant batteries, charging with heat during the day and slowly discharging it through the long, frozen night. Yet even the most perfectly designed fireplace was only as good as the fuel it consumed. Here, frontier families showed a mastery of preparation that was as much science as labor. They knew that hardwoods like oak, hickory, and maple burned hotter, longer, and cleaner than softer woods. These were not trees you could simply chop in the fall and expect to use that winter. Green wood, full of moisture, smoked more than it burned, wasting energy and filling the cabin with fumes. So, in spring and summer, long before the first frost, families set to work cutting, splitting, and stacking their winter fuel. Each log was arranged so air could circulate, drying it over months until it was light in weight, split at the ends, and rang with a hollow sound when struck against another, sure signs of proper seasoning. The cutting itself was strategic. Large logs were saved for overnight burns, their slow combustion ensuring a steady heat while the household slept. Medium-sized splits were used for maintaining an already strong fire during the day, offering a balance of flame and coals. Fine kindling, slivers of wood that caught easily, was reserved for quick bursts of heat or for restarting the fire from a bed of glowing embers. Nothing about this process was random. It was a rhythm as old as the settlement itself. When the time came to light a fire, families treated the act like a craft. Large logs were placed at the back of the firebox, smaller pieces toward the front. This layering created a staged burn, where the bigger logs provided the enduring heart of the fire and the smaller pieces could be adjusted for immediate warmth or faster cooking. But the true foundation of any long, burning fire was the coal bed. This glowing layer of embers, built up over hours of steady burning, acted as a bridge from one fire to the next. In the morning, when the room was still dark and frost clung to the inside of the windows, a few quick breaths on the coals and a handful of kindling could bring the fire roaring back to life. Airflow management was another quiet art that determined whether a family spent the night in comfort or misery. Too much air and the fire would burn too hot and too fast, wasting valuable fuel. Too little air and the flames would smolder, producing smoke and failing to provide enough heat. The best burns were clean, producing little more than a thin wisp of smoke in the chimney and a steady wave of heat in the room. Achieving this balance required constant attention, a relationship between family and fire built over years. Perhaps the greatest challenge was keeping the fire alive through the long night without having to rise every hour. Here, the technique of banking the fire came into play. Before bed, families would load the firebox with the largest hardwood logs they had, arrange them over a strong coal bed, adjust the damper to slow the burn, and then cover parts of the fire with ash. This ash blanket smothered the flames just enough to keep the logs from burning too quickly, while still allowing them to generate heat. By morning, the fire might be little more than a soft red glow beneath the ash, but it was alive, ready to be coaxed back into full flame with a few dry sticks. In these frontier cabins, the fireplace was never simply a decorative feature. It was a living system, designed, maintained, and respected as the central engine of survival. Every decision, from the angle of a firebox wall to the timing of a log split, was made with one goal: to keep the family alive through the coldest hours of the year. It was not brute force that kept the cold at bay, but the careful blending of craftsmanship, foresight, and discipline. Out in the wilderness, you could not afford to gamble with heat. Your fireplace had to work every time, because there would always come a night when failure was not an option. On the frontier, insulation was not a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. A blazing fire could roar all night, but without a way to trap its heat inside, the cold would creep in like a silent predator, robbing the air of warmth until the cabin felt no different from the frozen wilderness outside. The families who survived the most brutal winters were not just skilled at making fires, they were masters at keeping that heat where it belonged. And they did it without a single roll of store-bought insulation, without plastic vapor barriers, and without modern tools. Every inch of their thermal defense came from the land around them, shaped by hands that understood both the science and the urgency of warmth. The starting point was the wall itself. A single row of logs, no matter how thick, could not hold heat for long. The solution was double wall construction. 2 layers of logs, one facing the storm outside, the other forming the interior wall of the living space. Between them was a gap 6 to 8 inches wide. This gap was not wasted space, it was the engine of their insulation system. Into it went layers of natural materials that turned a drafty log cabin into a heat-trapping stronghold. The most important of these materials was moss, specifically sphagnum moss, which could be harvested from wetlands during the warmer months. It was light, easy to collect, and packed with thousands of tiny air pockets that trapped heat in the same way a down jacket does today. It also had a natural resistance to mold and decay, a blessing in the damp, fluctuating climate of frontier winters. Families would gather moss in late summer, spread it out to dry under the sun, and then pack it tightly into the wall gaps before the first frost arrived. When properly compressed, moss created an almost impenetrable barrier against wind and cold. But moss alone was not always enough. Animal hair and fur became vital companions in this battle against the elements. Every butchering season, hair from cattle, sheep, and even wild game was saved and stored. Trappers contributed furs from beaver, fox, and other animals which, once cleaned and dried, were shredded or layered into the wall cavity alongside the moss. Human hair, gathered from haircuts, was even added to the mix. These fibers tangled together to form a dense mat that slowed the transfer of heat, creating a living, breathing thermal wall that kept cold at bay. To seal the last vulnerabilities, families used a technique called chinking. Between each log of the outer and inner walls was a gap that could leak precious heat. Into these cracks went a mixture of clay and mud, often reinforced with chopped straw or animal hair to prevent cracking as it dried. This wasn't a quick slap of mud. It was applied in multiple layers, each pressed firmly into place, and inspected regularly through the season. A well-chinked cabin didn't just stay warmer, it also stayed drier, because sealing the gaps kept snowmelt and rain from seeping inside. Insulation did not stop at the walls. Cold seeped up from the earth, making the floor a critical weak point. The answer was a raised floor with a crawl space underneath, and that space was filled with whatever insulating material was available: dry leaves, straw, moss, or even discarded animal bedding. Some families discovered an ingenious trick, keeping small animals like chickens beneath the floorboards. The animals' body heat would rise into the living space above, providing a surprising boost in temperature. Windows and doors were another constant battleground. Glass was a luxury on the frontier, and even when it was available, a single pane of glass could not stand up to sub-zero winds. Heavy blankets or thick animal hides were hung over windows at night, layered like curtains to block drafts. Doors were fitted with strips of leather or fur along the edges, forming a soft but tight seal against the frame. In some homes, a second door was built to create a small entry vestibule. Stepping inside brought you into a sheltered space before the main living area, ensuring that cold air didn't rush straight in. Above all, the roof demanded careful attention because heat rises. Without proper insulation overhead, the warmth from the fireplace would bleed away into the night sky. Many frontier cabins had sod roofs, layers of bark or split wood on the bottom, followed by moss, leaves, and finally a thick layer of sod. The sod was not just dirt, it was a living, grass-topped blanket that absorbed water, resisted wind, and kept warmth in. In deep winter, snow on the roof became an additional insulating layer, further locking in heat. Maintenance was not an afterthought, it was a constant duty. The freeze-thaw cycles of winter could crack chinking shift sod or settle the moss inside walls. Families inspected their insulation regularly, patching weak spots before they became dangerous. A single gap could let in a draft strong enough to freeze water or make a sleeping space unbearable. Through all this effort, the guiding principle was simple but powerful: keep the warmth in, keep the cold out, and do it with nothing more than the resources nature provided. The work was physical, the techniques learned over generations, but the results could mean the difference between a warm night's sleep and a long, shivering vigil until dawn. In those cabins, insulation was more than construction. It was a silent shield always in place, holding back the relentless cold while the family within clung to life through another winter night. Water on the frontier was both a blessing and a threat. A man could survive weeks without food, but only days without water, and in the frozen grip of winter, finding liquid water became one of the greatest daily challenges. Streams that once babbled with life in summer turned to silent ribbons of ice. Wells froze from the surface down, and snow, though abundant, could not be consumed as it was without wasting precious energy to melt it. Yet survival demanded ingenuity, and so the people of the frontier devised ways to secure a reliable water source even when the land itself seemed determined to lock it away. The most reliable solution began long before the first frost. Those who planned ahead dug deep wells, not shallow ones that would freeze easily, but shafts that reached down to where the earth's warmth kept water flowing even in the dead of winter. Lining these wells with stone or timber helped prevent collapse and added a layer of insulation. Buckets were lowered by rope or chain, and when ice began to creep across the opening, they built small wooden housings over the wellhead. These housings were more than just covers. They were miniature shelters with moss, straw, and animal hides stuffed into the cracks to trap the earth's natural heat inside, keeping the bucket path clear and the water beneath liquid. For those without wells, running water was a lifeline. A river or creek, even if frozen at the surface, often held flowing water beneath a layer of ice. The trick was finding the right spot, usually where the current ran faster and the ice was thinner. With axes or chisels they cut small holes, never large enough to be wasteful or dangerous, then returned daily to keep them open. Some placed weighted logs or branches across the opening, which prevented it from freezing over completely. Others suspended buckets in the water itself so that when they returned, they could lift them out already full. Still, rivers and wells could be far from the safety of the homestead, and a blizzard could make the trip deadly. That's why many families built what were, in essence, indoor reservoirs. Barrels, casks, and clay pots were filled to the brim in autumn and stored in the warmest corners of the home, often near the fireplace or beneath thick insulating blankets. Some cabins had small cellars dug beneath them, where the earth's steady temperature kept the water from freezing solid. These stores were not meant for waste. They were guarded carefully, drawn from sparingly, and replenished whenever the weather allowed. Melting snow became both a necessity and an art form. Simply eating snow was never an option. It robbed the body of heat and could speed the onset of hypothermia. Instead, snow was collected in large iron pots and placed near the fire, where it would melt slowly without demanding the constant attention of boiling. The first meltwater was often discarded. It could carry dirt or debris trapped in the snow. Only the clean middle layers were kept for drinking. Sometimes, snow was layered with stones warmed at the edge of the fire, the radiant heat working from within to melt it more quickly. In times of desperation, ice itself became the water source. Blocks were cut from lakes or ponds using saws and chisels, then hauled back to the homestead. These blocks were stored in makeshift ice houses, holes dug into the ground and lined with straw, or wooden sheds packed with sawdust to slow melting. When water was needed, chunks were chipped away and melted. The work was laborious, but having a frozen reserve meant survival when other sources were unreachable. Keeping water liquid indoors was its own battle. Even stored water could freeze overnight if temperatures plunged low enough. To counter this, containers were often wrapped in thick furs or buried beneath piles of hay. In some cabins, water buckets were hung from the ceiling directly above the fireplace, close enough to absorb the rising heat, but far enough not to scorch the wood. Others placed their water inside larger tubs of straw, using the insulating power of air pockets to slow the freeze. Every drop was precious and nothing was wasted. Water used for washing was caught in basins and sometimes reused for chores like scrubbing floors or soaking hides. This frugality wasn't just about scarcity, it was about respecting the effort that went into securing every sip. Drawing water from a half-frozen creek in the biting wind, or chiseling through ice in the dark of early morning was not a task done lightly. Those who survived did so because they treated water not as a convenience but as the lifeblood it was. In the end, winter water gathering was less about tools and more about persistence. It required daily commitment, keen observation of the land, and the discipline to protect reserves for the leanest days. It was the quiet labor that never stopped, no matter the storm, no matter the cold, and it was this diligence that kept frontier families alive when the wilderness tried to freeze the very essence of life itself. Food preservation on the frontier was not just a matter of convenience. It was a matter of life and death. In the long winter months, when snow buried the land and hunting became scarce, a family's survival often depended entirely on what they had managed to store away during the warmer seasons. Every step of the process required foresight, skill, and a deep understanding of both nature's bounty and its dangers. There were no supermarkets to fall back on, no quick trips for supplies. Once winter locked its icy grip on the land, the pantry was either full or it was empty. Preparation began in late summer and ran deep into the crisp days of autumn. The moment the harvest was ready, work turned urgent. Vegetables like potatoes, carrots, onions, and turnips were dug from the soil and carefully sorted. Only the healthiest, unblemished specimens were kept for storage. Even a single rotten one could ruin an entire barrel. These root vegetables were then packed in barrels or crates layered with straw, sand, or sawdust to keep them cool, dry, and shielded from frost. The storage place, often a root cellar dug into the earth, was the family's most valuable treasury. During winter, a space where the ground itself helped preserve the harvest by maintaining a steady, cold temperature. Meat preservation demanded its own set of skills. In the late fall, when the weather was just cold enough to slow spoilage but not yet frozen solid, livestock was slaughtered. Nothing went to waste. Large cuts of meat were salted heavily, drawing out moisture and killing bacteria, then either hung to air, dry in smokehouses, or cured in brine-filled barrels. Smoking was not just about flavor, it was a method of adding an extra layer of protection, as the smoke coated the meat with compounds that slowed decay. For those fortunate enough to have steady access to ice, meat could be packed in tightly insulated boxes lined with sawdust, stored like a treasure in makeshift icehouses dug into the earth. Drying was another essential practice, especially for fruits and herbs. Apples were sliced thin, strung on long lengths of twine, and hung near the hearth where gentle heat could draw out the moisture without cooking them. Berries were spread on clean cloths and placed in the sun or near a slow fire until they became leathery and light. Dried goods were stored in linen sacks or airtight containers to keep pests at bay. These humble bags of dried fruit could bring a burst of sweetness into the bleakest winter day, a reminder of summer when the world outside was locked in white. Even dairy had to be handled with care. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, but butter could be churned and stored in earthen crocks, covered with brine to prevent mold. Cheese making was a way to transform perishable milk into something that could last for months. Wheels of cheese were aged in cool, dark cellars, each one turned regularly and brushed clean of mold. In a time when every calorie counted, these stored dairy products were not luxuries, they were survival fuel. Frontier families also learned the importance of variety. It was not enough to have one food preserved in bulk. A single failed crop or spoiled batch could spell disaster. So, they put away a little of everything: jars of pickled cucumbers and cabbage, smoked venison, dried beans, salted fish, hard biscuits, and even jars of syrup tapped from maple trees. This variety ensured that meals remained balanced, offering both nutrition and a sense of normalcy when the winter days grew long and monotonous. The preservation process didn't end with storage. It was ongoing maintenance. Families would check the cellar regularly, removing anything that showed signs of rot before it could spread. Barrels were topped up with brine, smoked meats inspected for mold, and jars checked for cracks or broken seals. It was a constant, quiet vigilance because losing a food supply in January could mean starvation by March. Preserving food also carried a cultural weight. The work was often done communally, with neighbors coming together for butchering days, sharing smokehouses, and trading preserved goods. This not only spread the labor but also created a kind of safety net. If one family lost their potato crop, another might trade them dried apples or smoked pork. In the harsh and isolated conditions of the frontier, cooperation was as important to survival as the preservation techniques themselves. By the time the first heavy snows came, the fruits of all this labor would be safely stored away. Opening the cellar door in midwinter to see rows of barrels, sacks, and jars was more than a relief. It was a triumph. Every container represented days of work under the sun, careful planning, and an unspoken battle against time and nature. Without these stores, the cold months would be nothing short of brutal. With them, there was a chance not just to survive, but to greet spring with strength enough to begin the cycle again. Shelter on the American frontier was far more than a roof over one's head. It was a shield against nature's most unforgiving forces. Building it was often the very first priority upon arriving in a new land, because without it, no amount of stored food or hunting skill could protect a family from the wind, rain, and deadly cold. It was not a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. And in those wild, unclaimed stretches of land, shelter had to be built quickly, often with nothing but the raw materials the land itself provided and the strength of one's own hands. For many settlers, the first home was nothing more than a temporary structure, what they called a dugout, a lean-to, or a tent made from canvas or animal hides. These makeshift shelters were crude but functional, offering at least a barrier against wind and snow until something more permanent could be built. Dugouts, for example, were created by digging into the side of a hill or bank, using the earth itself as insulation. They were dark, damp, and often infested with insects, but they stayed warmer in winter and cooler in summer than a tent could ever manage. In the first weeks or months on the frontier, such a shelter could be the difference between seeing the next spring or succumbing to frostbite and exhaustion. As soon as time and resources allowed, families turned their attention to building a sturdier home, and the log cabin became the iconic choice. Trees were plentiful in many regions, and logs could be shaped with simple tools like axes and adzes. The process was grueling. Felling trees, stripping bark, hauling them into place, and stacking them so that each layer locked into the one below it. The gaps between the logs were filled with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and moss, known as chinking, to keep out drafts. Roofs were often made from overlapping wooden shingles or thatched straw, depending on what was available. Every nail, if they had any at all, was precious and often reused from older structures. These cabins were rarely large, just 1 or 2 rooms, but they were strong, warm, and built to last for years. Inside, the hearth or stove was the heart of the home. It provided heat for the entire structure and was used for cooking, drying clothes, and even preserving food. In the coldest months, families might sleep close to the fire to conserve warmth, with children sometimes bundled together in one bed under heavy quilts or animal pelts. Furniture was simple, often handmade: tables, benches, and bed frames carved from the same timber that built the walls. Every inch of the space was functional, with lofts used for storage and hooks driven into beams to hang tools, lanterns, or drying herbs. In some parts of the frontier, particularly the prairies where trees were scarce, sod houses became the most practical option. These were constructed from thick, grass-covered blocks of earth cut directly from the land. Sod walls were surprisingly insulating, though they brought their own challenges: dust, insects, and the occasional snake finding its way indoors. Still, they stood firm against the brutal prairie winds and kept their inhabitants alive through both blistering summers and freezing winters. For those with more resources or time, shelters evolved into homesteads, larger, sturdier buildings that reflected years of labor and growth. These might include multiple rooms, porches, and even small outbuildings like smokehouses, barns, and storage sheds. But such homes were rare in the earliest days. Most frontier families lived in structures that were humble but dependable, built with the singular purpose of survival. Shelter was not only physical protection, it was a psychological anchor. In a world where the wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, a home gave people a sense of stability and control. It was a place to rest, to gather, and to mark the passing of seasons. No matter how small or rough, once its walls were raised and its door could be shut against the night, it became a sanctuary. Children played in its shadow, meals were shared within it, and stories were told by the fire as storms howled outside. Building and maintaining shelter was also a communal effort when possible. Neighbors, though often miles apart, would gather for house raisings, where men worked together to erect a structure in a single day while women prepared food to feed the crew. Such gatherings not only sped up the work, but also forged bonds between families, bonds that could mean mutual aid in times of trouble. The walls of a frontier home, then, were not just made of logs or sod. They were built from shared labor, trust, and the unspoken understanding that survival was a collective endeavor. In the end, the homes of the frontier were rarely beautiful by modern standards, but they were monuments to resilience. They stood against blizzards, thunderstorms, and the biting cold of long winters. They held warmth in their walls, both from the fire in the hearth and from the lives they sheltered. Each one was a testament to its builders' grit and determination, the first and most important fortress in the daily battle against the wilderness. Without them, no family could last long on the untamed edge of the American frontier. Clothing on the American frontier was never about fashion. It was about survival. Every stitch, every layer, every choice of material had to serve a purpose because the frontier did not forgive mistakes in preparedness. A sudden cold snap could kill just as surely as a lack of food, and a poorly chosen outfit could mean frostbite in winter or heat stroke in summer. In an environment where the weather could change drastically in a single day, clothing was both armor and a tool, shaped entirely by necessity. For most settlers, the materials came from what they could grow, raise, or hunt. Wool, linen, and leather formed the backbone of frontier wardrobes. Wool was valued for its ability to insulate even when wet, a lifesaver in snow and rain. Linen, spun from flax, was lighter and breathable, making it suitable for the warmer months. Leather, often tanned at home from animal hides, provided durability for boots, belts, and coats. Many families also relied on buckskin soft, supple deer hide, which could be crafted into shirts, pants, and moccasins that lasted for years. A typical man's outfit might include sturdy trousers, a shirt made from homespun fabric, and a vest or waistcoat for added warmth. Over this, a coat or jacket would be worn, often long enough to protect against wind and rain. Wide-brimmed hats were more than just sun protection. They shielded the face from driving snow or kept rain from dripping down the neck. For women, dresses were the norm, often made from calico or wool and layered with petticoats for insulation. Aprons were common, both to protect clothing from the wear and tear of daily chores and to provide extra pockets for carrying small tools or supplies. In the harshest weather, additional layers were essential. Shawls, cloaks, and capes were wrapped tightly around the body, sometimes secured with brooches or pins. Mittens and gloves were crafted from wool or fur, with some families lining them with rabbit or squirrel pelts for extra warmth. Footwear was perhaps the most critical element. Sturdy leather boots or moccasins were often lined with wool or fur, and in winter, settlers might stuff them with dried grass to help insulate their feet. In areas with deep snow, snowshoes made from bent wood and rawhide were used for travel, turning otherwise impassable terrain into a navigable path. Children's clothing followed the same principles, though often out of necessity. They wore hand-me-downs from older siblings or repurposed garments from adults. This sometimes meant a child trudging through snow in clothes several sizes too large, sleeves rolled up, or belts cinched tightly to keep trousers from slipping. Yet even ill-fitting clothes were better than none, and parents did what they could to ensure their children were as protected from the elements as possible. Clothing also had to be functional for work. Men needed garments that allowed for freedom of movement when chopping wood, hunting, or plowing fields. Women's clothing, though constrained by the styles of the time, was often modified on the frontier for practicality. Skirts were made shorter to prevent dragging in mud, and bodices were looser to allow for heavy lifting or long hours at the spinning wheel. Pockets were scarce in most clothing of the era, so settlers improvised by sewing small cloth bags into the inside of garments or wearing leather pouches on belts. Repair was a constant part of frontier life. Every rip, worn seam, or thinning patch of fabric had to be fixed quickly, often by lantern light after a day's work. Needles, thread, and scraps of fabric were treasured supplies, and nothing was wasted. Old garments were cut down to make clothes for children, and when fabric was too worn for that, it might become a quilt patch, a rag for cleaning, or stuffing for a pillow. Clothing was not replaced casually. It was maintained, adapted, and recycled until it could serve no further purpose. Some garments also held symbolic or personal value. A well-made coat passed down from a father to a son could be a source of pride, a reminder of home, or even a mark of status in a community where resources were scarce. Likewise, certain items, like a mother's hand-knitted scarf, carried emotional weight, offering comfort during long, lonely winters. Seasonal changes demanded constant adaptation. In summer, lighter fabrics like linen and cotton allowed air to circulate, though sunburn and insect bites were still daily hazards. Wide-brimmed straw hats and light shawls offered some relief from the heat. In autumn, heavier garments came back out of storage, often aired and repaired after months of disuse. Winter brought the heaviest layers, with families bundling themselves in every scrap of warm material they owned. And in spring, when snowmelt turned paths into muddy quagmires, boots and outer garments were constantly wet, making the durability of clothing even more important. Ultimately, clothing on the frontier was not an afterthought, it was a survival strategy. Every garment had to endure hard labor, harsh weather, and constant wear, often for years at a time. People did not dress to impress, they dressed to endure. The clothes they wore were as much a part of their survival as the food they stored or the shelter they built, and without them, life on the edge of the wilderness would have been impossible. Shelter on the American frontier was more than just a place to sleep. It was a lifeline. Without sturdy walls and a solid roof, the wilderness could swallow you whole. The vast stretches of land were both beautiful and brutal, and every season brought its own challenges. The frontier settler had to build not just a home, but a fortress against storms, wild animals, and the relentless cycles of heat and cold. There was no luxury of hiring contractors or ordering materials. Homes rose from whatever the land offered, crafted by the hands of the people who would live in them. For most newcomers, the first structure was little more than a temporary refuge, a lean-to made from branches and bark, or a crude tent fashioned from canvas if they were lucky enough to have it. These makeshift shelters provided minimal protection, but they bought settlers time while they planned something sturdier. Speed mattered as much as craftsmanship. A family arriving late in the season had to race the calendar before winter's first snow trapped them in the open. The log cabin quickly became the hallmark of frontier life, not out of romantic charm, but because it was practical. Trees were often abundant, and the tools for felling and shaping them, axes, adzes, and saws, were among the few possessions settlers brought with them. Logs were stacked horizontally, their ends notched so they locked together at the corners. The gaps between logs were filled with a mixture called chinking, made from clay, mud, straw, and moss, which kept out drafts and pests. The roofs were typically covered in wooden shingles or sometimes just layers of bark with a steep pitch to shed rain and snow. Inside, the layout was simple, often just a single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space for the whole family. A stone or brick fireplace was essential, not only for cooking but also for heat. The hearth became the center of the home, both physically and socially. In the coldest months, families might sleep on the floor near the fire, huddled together under layers of blankets or animal skins to conserve warmth. Furniture was usually homemade, rough-hewn tables, benches, and beds stuffed with straw or feathers. Every inch of space was used, with lofts under the roof storing grain supplies or sleeping pallets for older children. In areas where trees were scarce, such as the Great Plains, settlers adapted. Sod houses, or soddies, were constructed from thick strips of prairie grass and the soil it held together with its roots. These earthen blocks were stacked like bricks to form thick, insulating walls that kept out heat in the summer and held in warmth in the winter. Sod houses resisted fire and blended into the landscape, but they also had drawbacks. Dirt crumbled from the ceilings, insects found their way inside, and heavy rains could cause structural damage. Still, they were cheap, quick to build, and could last for years with proper maintenance. On the open plains, dugouts were another option, homes literally carved into the side of a hill or built partially underground. The earth itself provided insulation, and these shelters could be surprisingly comfortable if lined with wood or stone. However, they were dark, damp, and vulnerable to flooding. Many families started in dugouts before upgrading to cabins or frame houses when resources allowed. Windows were rare and precious. Glass was expensive and difficult to transport, so many settlers relied on greased paper stretched over wooden frames to let in light while blocking drafts. Doors were heavy, often made of thick wood slabs reinforced with iron hinges if available. In regions with hostile wildlife or tensions with neighboring groups, homes might have reinforced shutters or small openings that could serve as lookout points. Weatherproofing was a constant battle. Roofs had to be checked for leaks, walls patched where chinking had worn away, and floors swept to keep out pests. Chimneys needed regular clearing to prevent fires, and in the depths of winter, the family might spend hours each day hauling wood just to keep the fire burning. In summer, shade porches or lean-tos were sometimes added to provide relief from the sun, while in winter, extra layers of mud or sod might be applied to the walls for insulation. These shelters were rarely permanent in the way we think of modern homes. As families prospered, they often built larger or more refined houses, adding separate rooms, glass windows, or even painted clapboard siding. Yet for many, the first home remained a point of pride, a testament to their ability to carve a safe haven from a wild, untamed land. Every creak in the floorboards, every smoke stain above the hearth, told the story of survival. Building shelter was not just about protecting oneself from the elements, it was about creating a sense of stability in an unstable world. A solid roof meant children could sleep without fear of rain soaking their blankets. 4 walls meant a family could store food without worrying about animals stealing it. And a warm hearth meant life could go on even when the winds outside howled like wolves. The frontier home was the anchor in an ocean of uncertainty. It was proof that against all odds, settlers could stake their claim and endure. Whether made of logs, sod, or earth, these shelters were more than buildings. They were the first step in transforming wilderness into home. Transportation on the American frontier was not simply a matter of moving from one place to another. It was a constant test of endurance, ingenuity, and survival. The vast distances, unpaved terrain, unpredictable weather, and lack of established infrastructure made travel both physically exhausting and mentally taxing. Every journey, whether it was to a neighboring settlement, a trading post, or an entirely new territory, required planning, resourcefulness, and a deep respect for the challenges of the land. In the earliest days, before towns were connected by even the roughest of roads, the most reliable form of transportation was on foot. Settlers often had no choice but to walk for miles across rugged terrain, carrying supplies in packs strapped to their backs. Paths were not always clear. Travelers relied on rivers, mountain ranges, or other natural landmarks to guide them. The pace was slow and progress could be halted entirely by storms, flooding, or swollen streams with no bridges to cross. For these reasons, the early pioneers often moved in groups, both for safety and for the combined strength needed to carry heavier loads or assist one another in emergencies. As settlements began to grow, horses, mules, and oxen became indispensable partners in frontier travel. These animals were more than just beasts of burden, they were lifelines. Horses offered speed and agility, making them essential for carrying messages, scouting new routes, or traveling quickly between settlements. Mules, known for their stubbornness, but also for their endurance, could handle rough, rocky terrain where horses might falter. Oxen, slower but immensely strong, were the backbone of wagon travel, capable of pulling heavily loaded carts across miles of open prairie. Wagons themselves became iconic symbols of frontier transportation, especially the sturdy Conestoga wagons and the lighter, more maneuverable prairie schooners. The Conestoga wagon, with its curved floor and canvas cover, was ideal for heavy freight, though it was more commonly used in the east. On the long westward trails, families relied on prairie schooners, smaller wagons covered in waterproofed canvas stretched over wooden frames. Inside, every inch was filled with food, tools, bedding, clothing, and other necessities. The canvas tops shielded travelers from rain and sun, while the high sides helped protect against wind-blown dust. Still, wagon travel was far from comfortable. The wooden wheels jolted over rocks and ruts, and travelers endured days of bone, rattling motion that left muscles sore and spirits weary. Rivers and waterways provided another critical means of transportation. In many cases, it was faster and easier to float goods and people downstream than to haul them overland. Flatboats, canoes, and later steamboats transformed travel along major rivers like the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio. Steamboats, in particular, revolutionized frontier trade by allowing goods to be transported upstream as well as downstream, opening markets and speeding communication between distant settlements. However, river travel carried its own dangers. Sudden floods, shifting sandbars, and treacherous rapids could wreck a vessel in moments, and steamboat boilers sometimes exploded with deadly force. During the harsh winter months, frozen rivers and snow-covered trails required yet another adaptation. Sledges and sleighs pulled by horses or dogs allowed settlers to move across snowy expanses when wheels were useless. In some areas, snowshoes made it possible for hunters, trappers, and messengers to traverse deep drifts that would otherwise be impassable. These winter journeys were often life or death missions, fetching medicine for a sick child, delivering news of approaching danger, or bringing in vital supplies before a blizzard closed the way entirely. Travel was never without risk. Roads were often little more than rutted tracks cut through the wilderness, turning into quagmires after rain or becoming choked with dust in dry weather. Axles snapped, wheels broke, and animals went lame, stranding travelers far from help. Bandits, wild animals, and hostile encounters added another layer of danger. Even when no immediate threat loomed, isolation weighed heavily. Days could pass without seeing another human being, and the vast, silent stretches of wilderness reminded travelers just how far they were from safety. For many, transportation was also a communal effort. Neighbors often banded together for long journeys, forming wagon trains for both protection and efficiency. In such groups, tasks were divided. One person might scout ahead, another repair broken wagons, while others hunted game to feed the party. At night, wagons were often arranged in a circle, creating a makeshift barrier against wildlife and providing a central space for cooking and campfires. These nightly gatherings forged strong bonds, and shared hardships on the trail often turned strangers into lifelong friends. Over time, as more settlers arrived, roads began to improve. Stagecoaches began running along set routes connecting towns and carrying passengers, mail, and small parcels. The arrival of the railroad in the mid-19th century marked a turning point in frontier transportation. Suddenly, journeys that once took weeks or months could be completed in days. Trains opened the frontier to faster trade, easier migration, and more reliable communication. Yet, even with this advancement, many remote areas still relied on the older, slower methods for decades, and the image of the lone rider on horseback or the creaking wagon on a dusty trail remained part of daily life. Transportation on the frontier was more than a matter of convenience. It was the artery that kept settlements alive. Without it, there could be no trade, no communication, no rescue in times of need. Every trail blazed, every river navigated, every track laid by rail tied the frontier together and allowed life to flourish in places once thought unreachable. It was a constant reminder that survival depended not just on reaching one's destination, but on mastering the journey itself. Communication on the American frontier was not just about exchanging words. It was about bridging vast distances, overcoming isolation, and keeping the fragile connections between scattered communities alive. In a land where settlements could be separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness, where mountains, rivers, and hostile weather often stood in the way, the ability to send and receive messages quickly could mean the difference between life and death. It was a challenge that demanded creativity, endurance, and a willingness to brave danger for the sake of keeping information moving. In the earliest days of westward expansion, communication was primarily face-to-face. News spread through travelers, traders, and wandering settlers who carried stories from one settlement to another. This word-of-mouth system was slow and unreliable. By the time news arrived, it was often outdated or distorted, like a living game of telephone, played across the continent. Still, it was better than nothing, and the people of the frontier learned to cling to any scrap of information they could get. Whether it was about a coming storm, the price of grain in a distant town, or rumors of trouble with a neighboring tribe. As communities grew, more structured systems began to emerge. Riders on horseback became essential messengers. A trusted rider could cover great distances faster than anyone on foot, carrying letters, official notices, or urgent warnings. The job was perilous. Riders faced the threat of ambush, injury, and exhaustion. To ensure speed, many riders traveled light, carrying little more than a small bag of mail, a firearm, and a change of horses at designated waypoints. Sometimes they had to push through blizzards, torrential rain, or scorching heat, driven by the knowledge that their cargo might be critical to someone's survival. One of the most famous and romanticized communication systems of the frontier was the Pony Express, though it existed for only 18 months between 1860 and 1861. Young, daring riders, many in their teens, raced across a nearly 2,000-mile route from Missouri to California, switching horses every 10 to 15 miles at relay stations. The system was designed for speed, with each rider carrying a specially designed saddlebag called a mochila that could be quickly thrown onto a fresh horse. Messages that might have taken weeks by traditional mail could now arrive in about 10 days, though the Pony Express was short-lived, supplanted by the completion of the transcontinental telegraph. It remains one of the most enduring symbols of frontier communication. The telegraph itself revolutionized communication in ways few could have imagined. For the first time, messages could be sent almost instantaneously across vast distances, turning days or weeks of waiting into mere minutes. Telegraph lines slowly stretched westward, following the paths of railroads and trade routes. Small towns celebrated when they were finally connected, as it meant they could receive news of the outside world far more quickly. Telegraph operators became vital links in the chain, skilled at translating the rhythmic clicks of Morse code into words that could change lives, a warning of approaching trouble, an urgent request for supplies, or joyous news from family far away. Still, the telegraph was not an immediate cure-all. Remote settlements far from telegraph lines still relied on slower methods. Stagecoaches played a key role, carrying both passengers and mail along established routes. These coaches, often pulled by teams of horses, could cover great distances and deliver bundles of letters, newspapers, and official documents. The arrival of the stagecoach in town was an event. People would gather to hear the latest news, exchange letters, and learn of events happening in the wider world. The stage driver was often as much a bringer of gossip as of official information. For those living even further from established routes, communication could be sporadic at best. In such places, neighbors became each other's messengers, and travelers were entrusted with carrying letters or verbal messages along their journeys. Sometimes these messages were urgent, calls for medical help, news of a death, or warnings of danger. Other times they were simply attempts to maintain the bonds of friendship and kinship over long distances. Every delivered letter was a lifeline, a tangible reminder that someone far away still cared. Newspapers also played a surprisingly important role in frontier communication. Small local presses sprang up in growing towns, printing not only local news but also reprinting articles from larger eastern papers. For many settlers, reading the newspaper by lantern light at the end of a long day was their only window into the wider world. Even weeks-old news felt fresh in such isolated places, and newspapers often doubled as community bulletin boards, listing births, deaths, marriages, and notices of upcoming gatherings. Communication on the frontier was not always peaceful or routine. It was often entwined with matters of survival and security. Messages warning of approaching danger, whether from hostile raids, natural disasters, or disease outbreaks, could save entire communities. Signal fires, gunshots, and flags were sometimes used for rapid local alerts, especially when speed was more important than detail. In some areas, Native American tribes had their own established systems of communication, such as smoke signals or relay runners, which settlers occasionally adapted for their own use. Over time, as railroads expanded and telegraph lines became more widespread, the pace of communication accelerated dramatically. What once took weeks to relay could now be shared in hours. But even with these advancements, the frontier never fully lost its reliance on human messengers and physical travel. Weather, technical failures, and sheer remoteness often meant that the fastest way to get a message through was still to saddle a horse and ride. In the end, communication on the frontier was more than just a technical challenge. It was a deeply human endeavor. It was about staying connected in a world that was vast, often lonely, and sometimes dangerous. Every rider who braved the elements, every telegraph operator who tapped out a message, every neighbor who carried a letter across miles of open land was helping to weave a fragile but vital web that held frontier society together. Without those lines of connection, life on the edge of the American wilderness would have been not just difficult, but almost impossible. Transportation on the American frontier was the lifeline of settlement, trade, and survival. In a land where distances were vast, terrain was unpredictable, and weather could change in an instant, moving people, goods, and information required ingenuity, determination, and often a touch of sheer grit. The frontier was not built for comfort. It was built for necessity, and transportation reflected that reality. Every journey carried an element of risk, whether it was a trip to the next town for supplies, a cattle drive across open range, or a cross-country migration in search of new opportunities. In the earliest years of westward expansion, transportation was dictated by the limits of muscle and endurance. On foot or horseback, settlers, trappers, and traders traversed rough trails worn into the land by Native Americans over centuries. Horses, when available, were invaluable, not only for speed but also for their ability to carry loads over terrain where wagons could not pass. Mules and oxen were equally important, prized for their strength and endurance on long hauls through rugged landscapes. These animals were often the difference between reaching a destination or being stranded in the wilderness. As settlements grew and trade expanded, wagons became a central feature of frontier transportation. The iconic covered wagon, often called a prairie schooner, was the backbone of migration. Families packed their entire lives into these wooden, canvas-covered vehicles, hitching them to teams of oxen or horses for journeys that could last months. These wagons weren't designed for comfort. Most people walked alongside them to spare the animals, but they provided shelter from storms, storage for food and tools, and a movable home on the road. Wagon trains, with dozens of families traveling together, offered protection from bandits, hostile encounters, and the dangers of the wild. At night, the wagons would be arranged in a circle for defense, with campfires burning inside the perimeter. Rivers and waterways also played a crucial role in frontier transportation. Before railroads reached deep into the West, steamboats and flatboats carried passengers, mail and cargo along major rivers like the Mississippi, Missouri, and Ohio. River transport was faster than overland travel and could carry much larger loads, but it came with its own hazards. Shifting currents, unpredictable floods, and the ever-present risk of a boiler explosion on a steamboat. For many frontier towns, the arrival of a riverboat was a major event, bringing fresh goods, new settlers, and long-awaited letters from far-off places. Stagecoaches became the arteries of long-distance land travel in the 19th century, linking towns, military forts, and trading posts. These horse-drawn coaches followed established routes, stopping at relay stations where teams of fresh horses were swapped in to keep the journey moving quickly. Inside, passengers endured cramped conditions, jolting rides over rough roads and exposure to heat, dust, and cold. But stagecoaches were far faster and more reliable than wagon travel. They also carried mail, making them a critical part of the communication network before the telegraph and railroads took over. Stagecoach robberies, while less common than legend suggests, added an element of danger to the ride. Railroads would eventually transform transportation in the West more than any other single development. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, reducing months-long journeys to a matter of days. Suddenly, settlers could travel across the continent in relative comfort, with sleeping cars, dining services, and scheduled stops. Freight could be shipped in bulk, enabling industries like mining, ranching, and agriculture to flourish. railroad towns sprang up along the tracks, some becoming bustling cities while others faded away when routes shifted. Yet, rail travel still required connections. Once passengers left the train, they often continued by stagecoach, wagon, or horseback to reach their final destinations. For short-range and local travel, horseback remained the dominant method well into the 19th century. In towns, simple carts and buggies became common, allowing families to travel for shopping, church, or social visits. In rural areas, horseback riders could cross rough terrain, ford streams, and follow trails that no wagon or carriage could navigate. Skilled riders became legends in their own right, whether as cowboys driving herds to market, lawmen pursuing fugitives, or messengers delivering urgent news.